There's less than 300 drive-ins left across the entire United States. At the peak, there were over 4,000 drive-ins across the United States. So that's a really steep decline. They represent so many things that are just wonderful about being in community. And the theaters that survive are the theaters that are supported really well by their hometowns. Our whole family actually, operates the theater. So my mom, Linda's sister, is involved in the theater. And then I have two younger siblings who are also involved in like the websites and programming. So we all run it as a family business. So all of us are involved. They bought it in 2019. The reason they bought it was not originally to operate it as a drive-in movie theater, although that idea always existed. But they own the property adjacent to the Motorview. So they run the furniture store Wild West Designs. They shared a well with the Motorview Drive-In for all the years the Motorview was open. And when the property came up for sale, it sat there for almost 10 years or over 10 years, I think. And then they bought it in 2019. They wanted to, continue to secure their well rights, but also like there was this glimmer of like, maybe someday we might want to run this theater. And then, the pandemic hit and it was really challenging for the local high schools to find a place for graduation. So they reached out to Linda and Ryan and said, hey, is the Motorview an option for us to do graduations at? And at the time, like the bathrooms were in need of desperate repair. There was no real projector. The weeds were like up to your chest. They were so tall. But Linda and Ryan said, you know what, like this is a chance to help out and people need to have graduation. So let's get this theater whipped into shape. So, they did all the yard work and the weed work to make it a functional theater for those graduations. And that's when they worked with Andex to get projection and sound and all of those pieces in place. And they loved doing the graduations, and they decided in the middle of the pandemic to keep it open and show just kind of older movies, over the course of that summer. And it was so nostalgic and so wonderful that it just became something that we were like, we have to keep doing this. Like we love the drive-in and it has to be something that keeps going. So our family as a team kind of like took on the call. And all of us have, very different skill sets, but we all decided we wanted to jump in and keep the theater going. So that's where we're at now. How long
had it been sitting vacant when you finally opened it up again?
Yeah, so it had closed, I think in 2008 is when it stopped showing films. So it was, 11 years that it sat there with no movies showing. It was just an abandoned lot, basically, And it's interesting because Linda and Ryan, before they were in, I mean, they create these beautiful antler chandeliers and they have a furniture store. But before they did that, they were in the antique business. And they definitely have a love for like nostalgic things. And if you've been to the Motorview, you'll see like a lot of their touches there. That we have like this very cool Betty Boop statue. We have a big boy there. We have like some old like gas stands, gas tanks from old gas stations. So there's like a little bit of antiques in there, but there's something just so nostalgic and powerful about a drive-in movie theater. And I think once we saw that the community was like hungry to be at the drive-in, it made it really an easy decision to like keep it open and operating and invest some money in getting a digital projector and making it just a really incredible experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the very beginning. Motorview first went into operation in 1947, from what I know.
Correct. Yes.
The first one in Eastern Idaho.
Yes, the first one in Idaho.
First one in Idaho, period.
Yes.
Do you know the story of how it got started and who the original owner was?
Yeah, I know a little bit about that. So I did a little bit of background research just to make sure. But the story is, according to the Post Register, Hugo Jorgensen built it in 1947. It was at that time listed like the opening of it in the Post Register, said it had 612 spots for people to park in, which would make it a really large theater. It's not that big now. I don't know what happened to all those spots. Maybe cars got bigger, but now we can fit about 450 cars. So it was Jorgensen, and then he had a partner, Ed Moran, and he sold his interest to his partner, because Jorgensen, I think, had other theaters in like Rigby and in Utah. And so he sold it over to this other guy. And then Ed Moran kind of owned it for a number of years. And he served as like the sound engineer for the theater. And also at one point, I think in like the 1950s, they started doing Sunday services at the drive-in.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, right?
Like
Cool little tidbit.
having church there.
Having church there. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So the theater's done all sorts of things. It's done church, it's done graduations, it's done weddings, like you
Yeah.
name it, we've done it there.
What's his story? Like, why did he want to open a drive-in? What was his background?
Yeah, I don't know much about that. I think at the time, drive-ins were really spreading. He was probably a businessman who really saw an opportunity. And he owned other theaters. So I think it might have just been like that was his business. He was running that business.
So this was 1947. So this is 2 years after the end of World War II when he opens this.
Yeah.
What, like, at that time period, that seems to be when there seems to be a rise in popularity nationwide for these drive-in movie theaters.
Yeah.
Kind of started in the 30s and then just gradually got more popular from there. What do you think contributed? Like, why did they become so popular? Why at that time,
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think even then there was something that was kind of, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the right word for this. It was kind of wholesome, I guess, something kind of special. And because car culture became such a huge deal, especially in the 1950s, right? That's when we think of like drive-in, like restaurants becoming popular, right? Automation becoming popular. So
there's so many old movies that capture that.
Oh, of course. Like American Graffiti, how amazing is that movie? And it's the way that it captures like drive-in restaurants and drive-in theaters. By the way, we're showing that later this summer, just FYI. Because it's American Graffiti. Yeah, it's just like classic, like drive-in car culture kind of movie, And I mean, even this is a weird reference, but even if you think of the movie Dazed and Confused, right? They're driving around in their cars all day, all night. Like it just became a place for people to hang out, and cars became so important to Americans. I think it was just an extension of that love of vehicle, and that love of kind of what that equals with freedom, I think there's something there that makes it really cool. And then of course, like also sound, right? So we're talking about like an era with jukeboxes, and we're talking about an era with like movies kind of taking off too, it becoming more popular to have like big blockbuster movies, things that people wanted to see, that everyone was seeing. So I think all of those things combined to make drive-ins really, really fun.
So at some point, at least based on the people I've talked to so far, there have been several eras where drive-in theaters have kind of been on the decline a little bit. Yeah. There was one period in the 80s when VCRs came out.
Yeah.
And they started to decline simply because why would I go to a theater when I can stay and watch it at home now?
Yeah. The novelty of that, for sure.
But then in more recent times, like during the 2010 decade or so, they started to decline as well. What has caused them to decline most recently?
Yeah. So I actually think, even going back a little further, I think in the 70s, the oil crisis really put a damper on drive-in movie theaters too. So going back to the 70s, that's when we start to see like a pretty steep decline in people attending. I also think what's tricky about drive-ins is that they're really dependent on weather. They're often seasonal, so it's not a year-round business, right? So again, to have someone commit to it, you really have to commit to like especially in Idaho where summer is so short, right? You have to commit to really making it count for those few months that you're open. So yeah, in the 70s, the oil crisis. In the 80s, I think definitely the invention of the VCR led to a dramatic decrease. Those two factors combined led to a lot of drive-in movie theaters kind of gearing to more adult, where in the early 40s, 50s, 60s, it was much more about families. You could come, you could bring your kids, even if they were noisy, you could hang out in your car, they could run around. So then in the 70s and 80s, they became kind of like more adult, more horror oriented. And I think that led to them also kind of closing down. There was a lot less of a crowd. The digital revolution. So when in the 2010s, a lot of theater owners had run the same equipment for decades, and you could still get film, 35 millimeter film or old reels. But in the 2000s, people started needing to convert to digital, and those digital projectors are really expensive. And some theaters just could not do it. That upgrade, I think, really slashed the number of drive-ins that were able to exist. And then, of course, I think, more recently, I think there kind of became a little bit of a lack of interest. You think about what was happening in the later 2010s, and like sound and 3D and IMAX became really big. So we're talking about you really being immersed in a theater with sound all around you and this really big, bright, vibrant picture. And drive-ins don't offer that in the same way. We're really lucky. In 2021, we purchased a 4K RGB laser projector. It's phenomenal. It looks beautiful on the screen. People are still limited with the sound based on what they have in their vehicle. A lot of cars have really amazing sound systems, which is great. But if you're going to the movies to get like the highest quality of sound, that might not be your vehicle. That might not be your car. So I think that led to it a little bit. I also think like before the pandemic, there might have been a little bit of a disconnection to some of this nostalgic pieces that kept bringing people back to the movies. Something we noticed during the pandemic is people were actually really hungry for that, and they were hungry to be, in fellowship with other people, especially when people spent so much time at home and had to be separated. So I think that actually led to a major revival for some drive-in movie theaters. In many places, that kind of waned after a couple of years. We found with our theater, like it's only increased. Like every year we see more people come to the drive-in. We see more people who are like happy that it's open and feeling nostalgic that it's open. And that's a great thing for us because, we're committing to keeping our theater open as long as people are interested in attending. We really do it because we see it as part of the community.
So as of today, Motorview is one of, so when the Teton View closes in Rexburg, it will be one of 5 left in the state, right?
Yes, true. Yes, correct.
Motorview being the first one that went into operation in the state.
Mhm.
So with that in mind, what are your thoughts about just being one of the few drive-in theaters left?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. And I think there's something so special about drive-in movie theaters. I think also for Idahoans, there might be something about like the independence that comes with being able to like drive your car in and bring your whole family. And like for the 4th of July, we do a big July 3rd celebration. And we had people bringing in like flatbed trucks with like couches on it, like people setting up these amazing spaces for their families to come out and watch movies under the stars. I think it's just so beautiful to see the way the community comes together and wants to be present in this outdoor movie setting. I also think it remains an inexpensive way to have a night out with your family, where movie theater prices in big theaters can be, $13, $14, $15. Most drive-in movie theaters, and this is specifically in Idaho too, are, under $10 for adults to have a ticket to 2 movies a night, which is really amazing. I also think something that's really special about it is almost exclusively, and there's less than 300 drive-ins left across the entire United States. At the peak, there were over 6,000 drive-ins across the United States. So that's a really steep decline. But with these 300 theaters that are left across the United States, I think there's just something so special, nostalgic, and like something that people want to capture about that time. And really, to me, like, they represent so many things that are just wonderful about being in community. And the theaters that survive are the theaters that are supported really well by their hometowns. And they're almost exclusively locally owned and operated theaters across all 300 across the United States. You're not going to find like a lot of corporations owning these theaters. It's not that kind of business. It's a labor of love. So it's people who are living in those areas, operating those theaters. Some of them have operated them for decades, and just keeping them going for the community to enjoy.
Because there's about 300 left or so nationwide. Are drive-in theaters ever going to completely die?
I mean, a lot of people project that they will. A lot of people say that they're going to go, but if you look at the outpouring of love and support for the Teton View, now that people have found out that it's closing, and if you come to the Motor View on any given weekend and you see the crowds that are there, like really excited to be there, I think that in Idaho, maybe just in Southeast Idaho, maybe just the Motor View, I don't know. But I feel like where we are, there's just so much like community support and love for the drive-in. I don't see it going anywhere completely. We're not a state that has a huge number of drive-ins. Like you said, there's 5 that are going to be open after the Teton View closes. In New York, in Pennsylvania, they're in like the 20s, 30s. And those are larger population centers. But I think something that's wonderful about Idahoans specifically is like people are very community oriented. If people want to keep the drive-in open, they will, they'll keep showing up, they'll keep supporting. And so I have a lot of hope for the future of the Motor View, and, we'll keep responding to what the community wants and needs. And I hope we can stay open for, a really long time.